In this demonstration, we'll take a look at how to configure remote authentication on a Juniper device. Remote authentication is when the Juniper device forwards any authentication request over to a central authentication server, such as a Radius server or a TACACS Plus server. So in this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to configure the Juniper device to forward the authentication request over to a central server that is a Radius server. To configure your Juno's device for a Radius server, we use the set system Radius server command. You specify the IP address of the Radius server on your network, and this will configure the device for that Radius server. Now, the other thing you can do here is you can specify the source address. So which of the IPs that are assigned to this router do I want to use as a source address of the packets that are being delivered over to that Radius server? So I want to use 10.0.0.1 as my source address and forward authentication request over to the Radius server that resides at 10.0.0.100. So I hit enter there. Now there's a couple other settings that you may want to set. The next setting is a Radius server setting again. So I use set system Radius server. You specify the Radius server that you're applying the configuration to. And the next value that you want to configure is what the secret is. Now the secret acts as a password that was actually configured on the Radius server itself. So you have to match that same value here. So let's say the secret was set to 987654. If the secret has a space in it, then you have to enclose it inside of quotes here inside your command. But bottom line is you got to match the secret value that was specified on the Radius device, or Radius server. So essentially this acts as a password to help control which devices are allowed to forward authentication request over to the Radius server. So I hit enter on that. The next thing you may want to do is you may want to change the port value that's used to communicate with the Radius server. The default port value is 1812. So if you want to alter that, then you can use the set system Radius server, specify the IP address of the Radius server that you're configuring, and then you can use the port parameter and specify the port value. So I'm going to put 1812 there and hit enter. But again, that's the default value. Once you've configured the Radius server address, the secret, and optionally the port value, the other thing that you want to do is specify your authentication order on this device. So there's 3 different methods of authentication for a Juniper device. So they can authenticate using local passwords that have been configured on this device. In the case of using a Radius server, I'm not using my local passwords. So Radius is another authentication method, and TACACS Plus is another authentication method, which acts as another central authentication system. So when you configure your Juniper device, you want to make sure that you set the authentication order. So I do set system authentication order. I open the square brackets, and if I am using a Radius server, then I would prefer to authenticate people using Radius. So I want Radius to be the first method of authentication that's used. If for whatever reason that fails, then we can use the local password database that exists on my device here. And if that fails, then you could maybe turn around and say, you know what, then let's use TACACS Plus, right? So TAC Plus is the parameter to specify that. So I'm going to close the square brackets and then hit enter. So again, what I'm looking at here is my Radius server will be used as the primary authentication method. If the Juniper device fails to communicate with the Radius server, or if authentication fails to that Radius server, then it'll turn around and use my local passwords that are configured on this device. So the last thing that I want to mention here is that remotely authenticated users, so someone that connects to your Juniper device, will then get sent to the Radius server for authentication first, right? once the person has been authenticated by the Radius server, what's important to note is that that user is mapped to a user called Remote on this Juniper device if they don't have a local username that exists on the system itself. So what's important is you can assign admin permissions to all of our remotely authenticated users by assigning permissions to a special user called Remote. So that's what I want to do here is I'm going to use my set system login. The user called Remote will get the class assigned super user. So it'll give full administrative capabilities to anyone that's authenticated by that Radius server. Once I've got my configuration, then I want to make sure I commit those changes. There we go. So in this demonstration, you saw how to configure remote authentication on a Juniper device.